The sun was a hammer, and the sky was the anvil. Sterling Mackenzie felt every blow. It beat down on the cracked, thirsty earth of the Mackenzie Ranch, on the brittle skeletons of last year's sunflowers, on the corrugated iron roof of the barn that groaned under the assault. It beat down on the crown of his sweat-stained hat and worked its way through the bone of his skull, settling as a dull, throbbing ache behind his eyes. He was 38, but the drought had aged him a decade, for every year it had refused the land a drink. 3 years. He felt 68, felt as ancient and brittle as the fence posts that leaned like tired old men, their duty long since forgotten. His jeans were stiff with dust, his shirt a second skin of grime and sweat. Everything was failing. The wells had run dry, the cattle had been sold off for pennies on the dollar, and the bank's letters, each one a paper cut to his soul, were piling up on the kitchen table he no longer shared with Sarah. She had left in the spring, her departure as quiet and final as the last trickle of water in Antelope Creek. He couldn't blame her. There was nothing left to hold on to here but the ghosts of 3 generations and the suffocating weight of his own failure. He'd lost it all. The north pasture to a foreclosure, the river frontage to a slick corporate developer who'd talked about synergies and land consolidation. Marcus Blackwood. The name tasted like ash in his mouth. Blackwood had bought up the debt, circled the ranch like a vulture, waiting for the final, inevitable collapse. Sterling believed his own father, in his final clouded years, had started the rot, selling off parcels for reasons Sterling could only attribute to the dementia that had seemed to unravel him, or worse, a gambling habit whispered about in town but never confirmed. A legacy of failure. That's what his father had left him. A poisoned well, and Sterling, fool that he was, had kept drinking from it, believing he could somehow purify it with his own sweat and blood. Now, all he had left was this homestead, the barn, and one last, loyal friend. Or so he had thought. Thunder stood in the great shadowed maw of the barn doorway, immovable. The horse, a 20-year-old buckskin gelding with a coat the color of sun-cured wheat and a spirit as steadfast as the granite hills, refused to budge. He wasn't spooked. His ears weren't pinned. His eyes weren't wide with fear. He was simply planted, a living statue, a 4-legged bastion against his master's will. "Come on, you old fool," Sterling grunted, tugging on the lead rope. The rope went taut, creaking in protest. Thunder didn't even shift his weight. His head was high, his gaze fixed on some point in the dim, dusty interior of the barn. Sterling yanked again, harder this time, a surge of raw, frayed nerve frustration rising in his throat. "Move, damn you!" The horse tossed his head once, a mild rebuke, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. It was more than disobedience. It was a denial, a calm, absolute refusal. For 20 years, this horse had been his shadow, his confidant, the one creature on this earth who understood the language of his posture, the tension in his hands. Thunder had carried him through blizzards to find stray calves, stood patiently for hours while he mended fences, and nuzzled his shoulder after Sarah had driven away, leaving a silence in the house louder than any argument. And now, this inexplicable stubbornness. It felt like the final betrayal, the last loyal bolt in the entire crumbling architecture of his life shearing off. "What is it?" Sterling's voice cracked. He let the rope go slack and stepped closer, trying to see past the horse's broad chest into the barn. The air inside was thick with the scent of old hay, leather, and thyme. Dust motes danced like frantic sprites in the shafts of light lancing through the gaps in the wallboards. Nothing was out of place. The old tractor, silent for months, the tack hanging on its pegs, the empty stalls aching with absence. Everything was exactly as it had been yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. A museum of his slow-motion ruin. Yet Thunder stood sentinel, his body a living barrier. "There's nothing in there, you stubborn son of a bitch." Sterling's despair was curdling into a white-hot anger. It was easier than the grief. Anger was a fuel, a fire that could cauterize the wounds for a moment. He shoved at Thunder's shoulder, a pointless gesture against 1,000 pounds of bone and muscle. The horse just absorbed the impact, his skin twitching at the flies, unmoved. It was the final straw. The world had taken his wife, his cattle, his water, his future. It would not take his horse's obedience. This last bastion of order in his chaotic world would not fall. He stormed past the horse, ducking under his neck and stepping into the cool, tomb-like silence of the barn. He turned, ready to unleash a torrent of fury, to drag the animal in by sheer force if he had to. But the sight stopped him cold. Thunder hadn't moved. He remained perfectly framed in the doorway, a silhouette against the blinding, hostile sun. But it was his gaze that held Sterling captive. The horse wasn't looking at him. He was looking down, just inside the barn, at a particular patch of earth. Sterling followed his gaze. The floor of the barn was hard-packed dirt, smoothed and hardened by a century of traffic. Boots, hooves, wagon wheels. It was as solid as concrete in most places. But there, just to the left of the doorway where Thunder's gaze was fixed, was a section that was different. It wasn't a hole, not a mound. It was just disturbed. The color was a shade darker, the texture looser, as if someone had recently dug and then crudely refilled the earth. It was a small patch, maybe 3 feet by 2, an insignificant anomaly he'd probably crossed 1,000 times without a thought. But now, illuminated by the horse's strange vigil, it seemed to pulse with a silent, profound significance. His anger evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling curiosity. He walked over to the spot, his boots sinking slightly into the looser soil. He crouched, the denim of his jeans protesting. He ran his calloused fingers over the ground. It was definitely different, softer. He looked back at Thunder, who watched him with an unnerving intelligence, a soft nicker rumbling in his chest. It wasn't a sound of greeting. It was a sound of confirmation. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, pierced the fog of his exhaustion. His father, in those last few years. The ranch was already bleeding then, the drought just beginning its stranglehold. His father, David Mackenzie, had grown secretive, his eyes holding a distant, haunted look. He would disappear into the barn for hours. Sterling had assumed he was just puttering, lost in the fog of what the doctors had gently called cognitive decline. Sometimes Sterling would find him just standing there, staring at nothing, his hands trembling. Or he'd find tools out of place, a shovel caked with fresh dirt when nothing on the ranch needed digging. Sterling had written it off as dementia, the sad, nonsensical rituals of a mind coming undone. He'd seen his father as a figure of pity, a man fading into a ghost, accelerating the ranch's demise with his confusion. The shame of it had been a constant, bitter companion. Now, crouching on this patch of disturbed earth, a different, more unsettling possibility began to seed itself in his mind. What if it hadn't been confusion? What if it had been purpose? He stood up, his joints cracking. "All right," he whispered to the horse, to the ghosts in the barn, to himself. "All right. Let's see what you were guarding." He found the shovel exactly where he remembered seeing it last, propped against the wall, a faint layer of the same dark earth still clinging to its blade. He returned to the spot, the shovel feeling heavy and foreign in his hands, like a grave robber's tool. He hesitated for a moment, the silence of the barn pressing in on him. This felt like a transgression, like digging into a place he was meant to leave alone. He glanced at Thunder, who stood his ground at the door, a silent witness. The horse's steadfastness was no longer a betrayal, it was an instruction. "Here. This is it. This is what you need to see." Sterling took a breath and plunged the shovel into the soft earth. It gave way easily, the sound a soft, sucking sigh. He tossed the first shovelful aside, then another, and another. The work was rhythmic, hypnotic. With each scoop of dirt, he dug deeper into his own memories. His father, a man who could read the sky and the land like a book, suddenly unable to balance a checkbook. A man whose hands had roped cattle and built fences with unthinking grace, now fumbling with a simple coffee cup. The secret phone calls. The trips to town he refused to explain. The land sales. God, the sales. Piece by piece, the legacy built by his grandfather was sold off. "Just need to cover some losses, son," his father had mumbled, his eyes avoiding Sterling's. "A bad run of cards." Sterling had believed him. He'd raged and despaired, seeing his inheritance pissed away by a sick old man with a gambling addiction he'd hidden his whole life. He'd felt nothing but shame and resentment. He dug faster, the sweat dripping from his brow, mingling with the dark soil. He wasn't just digging in the dirt. He was digging through layers of his own judgment, his own bitter assumptions. He was unearthing the possibility that the story he'd told himself for the last 5 years was a lie. About 2 feet down, the shovel struck something hard with a dull metallic thud that vibrated up the wooden handle and into his arms. It wasn't a rock. The sound was hollow, final. He dropped to his knees, his heart hammering against his ribs. He clawed at the remaining dirt with his bare hands, the soil cool and damp against his skin. His fingers brushed against cold, rusted metal. He worked frantically, pulling back the earth until the shape was revealed. It was an old army surplus ammunition box, painted olive drab, its corners sealed with what looked like melted wax. It was heavy. He gripped the handle on top and heaved, wrestling it from its grave. He set it on the ground beside the hole, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stared at it, this ghost from the past, this thing Thunder had guarded and his father had buried. It was a Pandora's box of its own, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that opening it would change everything. The barn was no longer a museum of failure. It was a tomb, and he had just unearthed the sarcophagus. He sat back on his heels, the dust motes swirling around him in the silent, sacred air. He looked from the box to the horse. Thunder hadn't moved, but his head was lowered slightly, as if his long vigil was finally over. The silence in the barn was absolute, a held breath waiting for the past to finally speak. Sterling's reality, the one built on a foundation of his father's failure and his own, was about to be shattered. The key to the lock wasn't on the box, it was the moment itself. With trembling hands, he found a pry bar and wedged it under the lid, poised to break the seal on a history he never knew existed. The rusted hinges of the ammo box screamed in protest as he forced the lid open. The sound echoed in the cavernous silence of the barn, a shriek from a buried time. For a moment, Sterling just knelt there, staring into the dark interior, his breath held tight in his chest. The air that escaped smelled of old paper, dry ink, and something else. Something metallic and final, like a bank vault. The contents were packed tightly, a neat, orderly archive of a life he hadn't known. On top lay a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a drop of the same wax that had coated the box's edges. His name was written on it in his father's familiar, spidery script, Sterling. His hands trembled as he lifted the envelope. It felt impossibly heavy. He broke the seal, the cracking wax sounding like a snapping bone. Inside was a letter, several pages thick, filled with the same handwriting, dense and urgent. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the first words. My son. He sat back against a hay bale, the rough scratch of it a grounding sensation in a world that was tilting on its axis. The dust motes danced in the slanted light, a silent, swirling audience. He began to read, and the barn, the ranch, the entire universe of his despair began to dissolve. My son, if you are reading this, then several things have happened. First, I am gone. For that, I hope you have found your peace. I know my final years were not easy on you. Second, it means Thunder has finally done his duty. I trained him, you know. Not with ropes or commands, but with patience. I would bring him to this spot every day. I would stand here, and he would stand with me. He is a loyal soul, more loyal than any man. He knew this was a place to be guarded. He was guarding your future. And third, if you are reading this, it means you are at the end of your rope. It means Blackwood has likely pushed you to the very brink. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for all of it. But every bit of it, every damned, soul-crushing moment was necessary. Sterling stopped, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. Necessary? The word was a slap. The foreclosures, the debt, the shame. Necessary. He felt a hot surge of the old anger, the familiar resentment. He read on, his eyes flying across the page. You think I lost my mind. You think I gambled away our legacy. I needed you to think that. I needed everyone to think that. The truth, Sterling, is a more complicated and, I hope, a more brilliant thing. The drought. I saw it coming years before the first well went dry. I saw it in the patterns, the way the seasons were shifting. Your grandfather taught me to read the land, and the land was screaming a warning. I also saw men like Marcus Blackwood coming, vultures, men who feed on desperation. They don't buy land, they collect it. They wait for good men to break, then they pick the bones clean. I knew I could never fight him head on. He had armies of lawyers and endless pools of cash. The Mackenzie Ranch, as it was a perfect target. Land rich, cash poor, and vulnerable to an act of God like a long drought. To fight him on his terms was to lose. So I started a new game, a long game, my game. Sterling's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the paper steady. He took a deep, ragged breath, the scent of hay and dust filling his lungs, and forced himself to continue. The gambling debts? A story, a cover. I needed a plausible reason for selling off land, for being desperately, foolishly in need of cash. Every dollar from those bad runs of cards was accounted for. Every parcel of land I sold was a strategic sacrifice. I didn't sell them to just anyone, son. Look deeper in this box. You'll find the incorporation papers for a company called Prairie Holdings, LLC. A shell company. My shell company. I was selling parcels of our own land. To myself. For pennies on the dollar, establishing a market value so low it would keep other predators away. Why would they circle a carcass another vulture was already picking clean? He let the letter fall into his lap for a second, his mind reeling. He fumbled in the box, his fingers finding a thick manila folder. He pulled it out. Prairie Holdings, LLC. Inside were deeds, transfer documents, records of sales, the north pasture, the river frontage, all sold to this anonymous corporation for a fraction of their worth. His father hadn't lost them. He had hidden them. Sterling felt a wave of dizziness, a profound disorientation, as if the solid ground of the barn floor had turned to water. The shame he had carried for his father's weakness, his profligacy, was dissolving, being replaced by a terrifying, brilliant light. His father wasn't a fool. He was a grandmaster, and Sterling had only ever been allowed to see the pawns. He picked up the letter again, his vision blurred with tears he didn't understand. Were they tears of anger, relief, grief for the man he had so profoundly misunderstood? Blackwood was smarter than the rest. He didn't just want the land. He knew the real prize in this country would soon be water. He had his geologists, his surveyors. He knew about the Ogallala Aquifer, the parts of it that ran under our property. He thought he was playing the long game, too. He bought up my debt from the bank, thinking he had me cornered. He let me keep this homestead, the house and the barn, as a final insult. He thought he was leaving you with a worthless, dried-up patch of dirt that he could snap up for nothing when you finally broke. He was wrong. He has the surface rights to the land he foreclosed on. He thinks that includes the water. It does not. This is the heart of it, son. The ace I've kept hidden up my sleeve for 10 years. Before I started selling anything, before the first rumor of gambling ever left my lips, I went to see a man in Austin, a brilliant, sharp-as-a-tack water rights attorney named Jake Morrison. We spent 6 months structuring it. We legally severed the deep aquifer water rights from the surface rights of the entire Mackenzie Ranch, and from the adjacent lands I was secretly buying. It's a complex piece of legal artistry, ironclad and recorded so obscurely it would take a year to find if you didn't know exactly where to look. Blackwood owns a beautiful, sprawling desert. You, Sterling, own the well. Sterling's breath hitched in a sob. He dropped the letter and plunged his hands back into the box. Underneath the folder for Prairie Holdings was another, heavier one. He pulled it out. On the front, in his father's hand, were the words, "The Ace." He opened it. Inside, protected in a plastic sleeve, was a deed, a water deed. It described, in dense legalese, the sole and exclusive rights to drill, extract, and use all subterranean water below a depth of 200 feet from a parcel of land that encompassed not only the original Mackenzie Ranch, but 3 adjacent properties as well. The properties he had secretly bought through Prairie Holdings. It was signed by his father and notarized by a name he didn't recognize. At the bottom was the contact information for one Jake Morrison, attorney at law. It was too much. The brilliance of it, the sheer audacity, the years of deception, the lonely burden his father must have carried, watching his son look at him with pity and contempt, all while secretly building him an ark. The shame Sterling now felt was not for his father, but for himself, for his blindness, for his failure to see the man, not the myth of the man he had created. He picked up the letter, his hands now steady, his purpose clear. There was one last page. Blackwood will come for you. He will be arrogant, confident. He'll try to intimidate you. He'll offer you a pittance for this last piece of our home. Let him talk. Let him lay his cards on the table. And when he is finished, you will show him that deed. You will not yell, you will not gloat, you will simply show him that he has lost. A man like Blackwood isn't beaten by fists. He's broken by the quiet, irrefutable truth that he was outsmarted by the very people he disdained. There's one more thing in the box, the key. When this is all over, when the water is flowing and the land is green again, I imagine you might need a fresh start. Or maybe Sarah will come home. I always liked her. She has grit. But if not, if this place holds too many ghosts, the key is to a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Billings, Montana. Inside you'll find the deeds to a 2,000-acre ranch in the Paradise Valley, bought and paid for. A place with a river running through it, a place that never knows drought. It's a backup plan, your escape if you need it. I only ask one thing. Don't sell this place. Don't let Blackwood have a single inch of it. Make him watch it come back to life. Make him watch you win. Forgive me for the deception, son. It was the only way I knew to save you. Your inheritance isn't this land. It's the strength to hold on to it. You have that strength. I always knew you did. Your father, David. Sterling let the letter fall. He reached into the box, and his fingers closed around a small, cold brass key. A simple key to a safety deposit box. A key to another life. He looked at it, then at the water deed, then at the incorporation papers. A tangled web of gambling debts, secret sales, and a brilliant long con. A legacy not of failure, but of fierce, complicated, and utterly profound love. He stood up, his body feeling light, electrified. The weight that had been crushing him for years was gone, replaced by a crystalline, cold resolve. He walked to the barn door and stepped out into the blinding sun. The heat no longer felt like a hammer. It was just heat. The cracked earth was no longer a testament to his failure. It was a blank canvas. He walked over to Thunder and laid a hand on the horse's powerful neck. The buckskin hide was warm, alive. Thunder turned his head and nudged Sterling's chest, a soft, rumbling sigh escaping his nostrils. His vigil was done. The secret was safe. Sterling looked out over the parched, desolate landscape. He saw the dust devil dancing on the horizon. He saw the shimmering heat rising from the road, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his marrow, that Marcus Blackwood was coming. He could almost hear the crunch of tires on the gravel. Let him come. The game had been set by his father a decade ago. Now, it was his turn to play the final hand. He was no longer a victim waiting for the end. He was a strategist, armed with a truth as deep and powerful as the water sleeping beneath his feet. The silence of the High Plains afternoon was broken by the sound his father had predicted. The low growl of a powerful engine. A plume of dust, stark white against the brittle brown of the landscape, rose from the county road, drawing a straight, aggressive line toward the ranch. Sterling watched it come, his hand still resting on Thunder's neck. The horse stood beside him, a silent, solid presence, his flank warm against Sterling's leg. The black sedan that emerged from the dust cloud was as sleek and predatory as a panther. It crawled up the long driveway, its tinted windows hiding the man inside, and came to a stop a few yards from the porch, its engine purring with an expensive, arrogant confidence. The driver's door opened, and Marcus Blackwood unfolded himself from the car. He was a man tailored by money. His suit was a sharp, dark gray that seemed to repel the dust and heat. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, absurd on the cracked earth of the Mackenzie driveway. He was younger than Sterling, maybe early 40s, with a handsome, sterile face and eyes that held the flat, assessing gaze of a man who saw everything as an asset or a liability. He saw Sterling and offered a smile that didn't reach them. "Mackenzie," he said, his voice smooth, curated. "Tough day to be outside." Sterling didn't answer. He just watched Blackwood approach, his own posture deceptively relaxed. He had walked from the barn to the porch, sinking into one of the two old rocking chairs. Thunder had followed, untethered, and now stood at the base of the porch steps like a guardian. The father's letter and the deed were on the small, weathered table beside him, weighted down by a rock. Blackwood stopped at the bottom of the steps, his expensive shoes inches from the dust. He looked from Sterling to the horse and back again, a flicker of something, amusement, disdain, in his eyes. "Still holding on to the old guard, I see. Probably costs a fortune to feed him." "He earns his keep," Sterling said, his voice even, calm. It was a voice he hadn't heard himself use in years. The frantic, frayed edge was gone. Blackwood's smile widened. It was the smile of a winner about to take a victory lap. "Sterling, I'll be direct. We both know this situation is untenable. You're broke. The land is worthless without water. I hold the note on this place, what's left of it. The bank officially signed it over to Blackwood Development this morning. Technically, I could have the sheriff out here with an eviction notice by sunset." He paused, letting the threat hang in the hot, still air. Sterling just rocked gently in his chair, the rhythmic creak a stark contrast to Blackwood's polished monologue. He was following his father's script. Let him talk. Let him lay his cards on the table. "But," Blackwood continued, adopting a tone of magnanimity, "I'm not a monster. I respect what your family built here, even if it's come to this. I'm prepared to make you an offer, a final one. I'll forgive the debt entirely, and I'll give you $20,000 cash, enough for you to walk away clean, start somewhere new. It's more than this scrap of dust is worth, but consider it a gesture of goodwill." It was the final insult, cloaked in generosity. The offer was designed to crush any last vestige of hope, to make Sterling feel like he was being granted a mercy when he was actually being swindled. The Sterling of yesterday would have either exploded in a blaze of futile rage or crumpled in silent defeat. The Sterling of today listened and waited. "You've bought up a lot of land around here, Blackwood," Sterling said, his voice conversational. "The old Miller place, the Jackson Quarter section, my north pasture." Blackwood shrugged, a small, elegant movement of his shoulders. "It's a portfolio diversification. Land is a stable asset." "It's a desert," Sterling stated, not as a complaint, but as a fact. "Without water, it's just dirt. You have geologists, surveyors. They must have told you that." A flicker of genuine curiosity crossed Blackwood's face. He hadn't expected a conversation. He'd expected a negotiation born of desperation. "My geologists tell me a great many things, Mackenzie. They tell me the future is about resource management. Let's just say I have a long-term vision for the valley." "The aquifer," Sterling said. The word dropped into the space between them like a stone into a deep well. Blackwood's composure tightened almost imperceptibly. His smile became a little more fixed, a little more brittle. "The Ogallala is a regional treasure. My plan would be to utilize it responsibly, of course, to bring life back to this valley." "Your plan," Sterling said, stopping the rocking chair with a deliberate placement of his boot, is to drain it dry to feed a massive corporate cattle operation and a bottling plant, and leave everyone else in this county with nothing but sand. Your plan is to own the water." The silence that followed was heavy, charged. Blackwood's mask of civility finally slipped. His eyes went cold. "My plans are my business. Your business is the paper in my hand that says I own you. Now, are you going to take the offer, or do I call the sheriff?" This was the moment, the pivot point his father had engineered a decade ago. Sterling felt a strange calm settle over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was the custodian of his father's final, brilliant act of defiance. He reached over and picked up the heavy paper from the table, removing the rock that held it down. "You're right about one thing, Blackwood," Sterling said, his voice dropping, carrying a new weight of authority. "The future is about water. Your geologists are good. They found the water. But your lawyers? They're not as good as mine." He leaned forward and held out the deed. "You should read this." Blackwood stared at the paper, then at Sterling's face, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He hesitated, then snatched the document from Sterling's hand, his arrogance warring with a nascent sense of unease. He unfolded the paper. Sterling watched his face as he read. He saw the initial confusion as Blackwood scanned the dense legalese. He saw the slight furrow of his brow. Then he saw the moment of comprehension, the way Blackwood's eyes darted back to the top of the page, rereading, his mind refusing to process what the words were saying. He saw the blood drain from his face, leaving his tanned skin looking sallow and pale under the harsh sun. The smooth, confident mask of Marcus Blackwood crumbled into dust, revealing the raw shock of a man who has just been checkmated in a game he didn't even know he was playing. This is impossible," Blackwood stammered, his voice losing its polished veneer. "The water rights are appurtenant. They run with the land. They can't be severed like this." "They can," Sterling said quietly. "If you have a very, very good lawyer. My father had one. His name is Jake Morrison. You can call him if you like. This deed was filed and recorded 10 years ago, before my father sold a single acre, before you even knew this valley existed. It grants sole and exclusive rights to all subterranean water below 200 feet to the legal owner of this homestead parcel." He gestured around him at the dusty yard, the old house, the barn. "That's me." Blackwood stared at the deed as if it were a snake. He looked up at the vast, sprawling expanse of dry land he had spent millions acquiring. Land that was, without access to the deep aquifer, effectively worthless. A massive, beautiful desert. "You own the surface," Sterling continued, pressing his advantage, his voice cold and precise. "You can build on it. You can graze it if you can find a blade of grass. But if you try to sink a well deeper than 200 feet, you'll be hearing from Mr. Morrison. And he is, I assure you, extremely thorough." Blackwood's face was a ruin of his former confidence. The predator was gone. In his place was a man staring into a financial abyss. He had sunk his fortune into a dead sea. "What do you want?" Blackwood finally whispered, the words ragged. Sterling leaned back in his chair, the slow, rhythmic creaking starting up again. He looked at the man before him, not with hatred, but with a kind of detached pity. His father had wanted him to make Blackwood watch, to make him watch the land come back to life. Vindication wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming what was stolen. "I want you to sell me back my land," Sterling said. "The north pasture, the river frontage, everything you took. And I want to buy the Miller place and the Jackson Quarter section too. I'll pay you what you paid for them, not a penny more. You'll take a loss on the interest and the legal fees. Consider it a gesture of goodwill." He had used Blackwood's own words, turning the knife of his condescension back on him. Blackwood flinched as if struck. He looked wildly around, at the house, at the endless sky, at the impassive horse standing guard. There was no way out. Sterling owned the water. He owned the future of the entire valley. Without another word, Blackwood crumpled the deed in his fist, a spasm of pure, impotent rage. Then his shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned and walked back to his car, his polished shoes scuffing in the dust. He got in, slammed the door, and drove away, much faster than he had arrived, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the sweet, clean silence of victory. Sterling watched until the car was a speck on the horizon. He took a deep breath, the air tasting different, cleaner. He looked down at Thunder. The old horse nudged his hand, then let out a long, contented sigh. The battle was over. The long game his father had set in motion was finally won. Now, the work of rebirth could begin. The sound that changed the world was not a clap of thunder, but the rhythmic, percussive chug of a drilling rig. For a week, it was the only sound that mattered, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to salvation. Sterling worked alongside the crew Jake Morrison had sent, his body aching with a satisfying exhaustion he hadn't felt in years. It was the ache of building, not breaking. He was powered by a new kind of energy, a humming resolve that had settled in his bones. On the 7th day, it happened. A change in the sound of the drill, a shout from the foreman, and then a gush. Not a trickle, but a powerful, roaring spray of water, clear and cold, erupting from the pipe and splashing onto the cracked, waiting earth. The crew cheered. Sterling just stood there, letting the spray mist his face, his clothes. He closed his eyes and simply listened to the sound of life returning. It was the sound of his father's final words, of Thunder's loyalty, of his own reclaimed future. He bent down and scooped a handful of wet mud, the first mud the ranch had seen in 3 years. It felt like a sacrament. He squeezed it in his fist, and it held. The land was no longer dust. It was becoming whole again. The transformation was slow, then sudden. He ran pipes from the new well, and the sprinklers began their lazy, sweeping dance across the home pasture. At first, the water seemed to vanish, swallowed by the thirsty ground. But then, a change. A faint green blush appeared near the sprinklers, a delicate fuzz that seemed impossibly vibrant against the brown. Day by day the greens spread, a soft, inexorable tide reclaiming the land. The scent of the air changed, losing its dusty edge and taking on the rich, damp smell of growing things. The brittle silence was replaced by the murmur of water, and soon the buzz of insects returning to the grass. Blackwood, true to his broken spirit, had complied. The contracts were signed in Jake Morrison's office, a sterile, quiet affair where Blackwood refused to make eye contact. Sterling now owned his family's original ranch, free and clear, along with the adjacent lands that secured his water for generations. He didn't gloat. He just signed the papers, his father's penmanship a ghost beside his own. He was not just a son inheriting land, he was a partner completing a plan. One afternoon, as he was out mending a fence line on the newly acquired north pasture, the same fence his father had taught him to string 30 years ago, he saw a car coming up the drive. Not a sleek black sedan, but a familiar, dusty SUV. He stopped his work, pulling off his gloves, his heart giving a cautious, hopeful thump. The car stopped and Sarah got out. She looked different, rested, but her eyes were the same, holding the same cautious intelligence. She didn't rush to him. She just stood there, taking it all in. The impossible green of the pasture, the sound of the distant sprinklers, the solid way he stood, no longer bent by the weight of failure. "I heard in town," she said, her voice quiet, carrying on the breeze. "They said you struck water." "My father did," Sterling replied, his own voice thick. "A long time ago. It just took me a while to find it." She walked closer, her gaze sweeping over the revitalized land, then settling on his face. "You look different." "I feel different," he said. And it was true. The raw anger and despair had been scoured out of him, replaced by a quiet, foundational strength. They stood in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the wind and the creak of the wire stretcher in his hand. It wasn't the silence of distance anymore, but a space for understanding to grow. "I'm sorry I left," she said finally, looking at the fence line he was mending. "I'm sorry I gave you every reason to," he answered. I was lost. I thought I had to carry it all alone. I thought his legacy was failure. I was wrong about everything. She reached out and touched the new fence post he had just set. It was solid cedar, its scent sharp and clean. "Is there room for someone to help you rebuild?" she asked, her eyes finally meeting his, full of a question that had nothing to do with land or water. He didn't need to answer with words. He just reached out, his calloused hand covering hers on the cedar post, her fingers interlaced with his. It felt like coming home. They were not the same people who had broken apart. They were stronger, scarred and rebuilt, ready to build something new on a foundation that had been tested by fire and drought and redeemed by a love that had played the long game. Years passed. The ranch thrived. It became an oasis, a patchwork of verdant green against the drier hills of the valley. The cattle were back, their descendants grazing on lush alfalfa. The house was filled with warmth and the low murmur of a life shared. The key to the Montana ranch sat in a drawer, a reminder of a path not taken, a testament to a father's love that had provided not just one, but 2 chances at salvation. Thunder lived out his days in peace and honor. He grew gray around his muzzle, his steps slower, but his eyes never lost their quiet intelligence. When his time came, he lay down in the shade of a great cottonwood tree overlooking the pasture he had helped save, and went to sleep. Sterling buried him there, on a gentle rise, marking the spot with a single, large river stone. Now Sterling stood in that same spot, a man in his late 50s, his hair silvered at the temples, his face lined with the sun and wind of a life well lived. Sarah was on the porch, the lights of the house a warm, welcoming glow behind him. He looked out over his legacy, the deep green fields, the fat, contented cattle, the glint of water in the irrigation ditches under a rising moon. He placed his hand on the cool, smooth surface of Thunder's gravestone. He finally understood. He had thought his inheritance was the deed to a piece of property, a thing that could be lost. He was wrong. His father's gift wasn't the land itself, but the secret history of the struggle to keep it. It was the knowledge that loyalty could be deeper than obedience, that salvation sometimes required deception, and that true ownership wasn't about possessing something, but about understanding its story. The ranch had never been his to lose. It had been his to finally, truly earn. And as the cool night air settled over the whispering grass, Sterling Mackenzie felt a profound and hard-earned peace, rooted as deeply as the old cottonwoods, watered by a love that had refused to let the land or the sun die of thirst.